As if the future course of history has been settled. People talk of the triumph of the West, of the victory of liberal democracy and the free market, and even of the end of history. The questions which have concerned humanity for so long: what is society for? How should it be organized? What are human rights and freedoms? And how do they relate to nature and to the spiritual? These questions about the goals of life, it is said, have now been settled in favor of the values of the West. But there have been, and there still are, civilizations which have seen the world very differently. Civilization arose independently in a handful of places on the face of the earth. In Iraq, Egypt, India, China, and here in the jungles of the Americas. And the oldest and greatest of those, India and China, are still alive in the land of their birth. And each of those civilizations created a unique and distinctive vision of life, which forms a vital counterpoint to that of the West. This series of journeys is a search for those first civilizations and their continuing legacy.
It's through such images that the West has come to know Iraq. To most of us, its history and culture were a blank before 1991. Yet by terrible irony, when the Western powers came to make war here in Iraq, they were returning to the very source of their own civilization. This journey was made on the eve of the Gulf War. It's a journey through Iraq and through Iraqi history, back to the origins of the first civilization. Searching in the present for clues to the past, and in the past for clues to the present. Civilization means life in cities. It means large populations with great ceremonial buildings. It means writing, and all these things are found for the first time on Earth, here in this ferocious landscape of South Iraq, Old Sumer. Here was the first law, the first science, the first war. And now, what remains is a stark warning to our pride in the human achievement. For this is all that's left of the world's first cities. Civilization was born on the banks of two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Mesopotamia, as the Greeks called it, the land between the two rivers, had few other natural resources. No stone, no wood or precious metals, only water and a rich alluvial soil with which a hard-working people could transform a land of scarcity into a land of plenty. And the other great resource of Iraq was its people. Iraqis are a mixture of Arabs, Kurds, Turks, Persians, whose ancestry goes back to the mysterious people who created the first civilization, the Sumerians. Their character today is still the same as in their ancient proverbs: long-suffering, resilient, hard-bitten, pessimistic. Heirs to a brilliant but terrible history, repeatedly conquered by their neighbors, or brutalized by rapacious military regimes whose conception of justice was an iron fist in the land where law was first devised. Not surprisingly, they were a people who pondered deeply the meaning of life. Iraq is matched only by India as a cradle of religions, rich alternative traditions which have all ended up living side by side. The history of Iraq, then, is rich in splendors and sorrows, the most gifted of civilizations and yet the most tragic, the first attempt by humankind to bring people together in organized societies with a measure of happiness. Another key quality of civilization is continuity or rootedness. The old towns of Iraq are the oldest continuously inhabited on Earth. And it was to places like this, Tel Afar, in the 19th century, that Western explorers came for the first time, looking for origins in the land which the Bible said was the cradle of the human race.
Here at Tel Afar, at the dawn of Mesopotamian archaeology, in 1846, the English excavator Austin Layard, famous for his discoveries at the cities of Nineveh and Nimrud, climbed up here to the top of the citadel one evening. And as the sun set, he says, I looked out and counted over 100 Marns out there throwing their long and darkening shadows across the plain. Each of those mounds had built up over millennia with the accumulated debris of human settlements. The one on which this citadel is built has more than 50 feet of debris extending back 6,000 years. Perhaps nowhere, as here in Iraq, is there such a continuity. And some of those cities, out there in the plain to the south, were among the most famous in the history of the world. Ur of the Chaldees, Nineveh, Babylon, source of some of the greatest tales in our culture. The creation, the flood, the Garden of Eden, the Tower of Babel.
Those stories all come from the magical landscape of Iraq's deep south. Here, on the edge of the great alluvial plain of Sumer, is a wild and beautiful marshland where the Tigris and Euphrates meet. This was the biblical Garden of Eden. Up to the very eve of the Gulf War, it was still possible to enter this world and see a way of life preserved for thousands of years, since long before civilization, the Marsh Arabs. The Marsh Arab villages look much as the first settlements must have done. Man-made islands in freshwater lagoons where they still live by fishing, raising water buffalo, cutting the reed beds, and cultivating the rich soil along the shores and levees. Their reed houses, some nearly 100 feet long, are still built in the same fashion as was depicted 5,000 years ago in the art of Sumer. In this world of almost limitless potential, the book of Genesis says the first cities arose in the beginning, when God let dry land rise from the water. And in the beginning, said the Sumerian myths, was Eridu. Legend said this was the mound of creation, the first land which arose from the primal sea at the beginning of time. Here was a sacred shrine which preceded the first cities. At the root of civilization is the temple.
Eridu is lonely, windswept and abandoned today. But it was one of the most famous places in the history of Mesopotamia. Not only did the Sumerians believe that this was the site of the mound of creation, they thought that here kingship, that is political society, first came down to earth, and that here the arts of civilization were initially developed. It originally stood on a great sea of fresh water stretching out to the south, the Apsu. And the great temple here, the most famous shrine in Sumer, was named after it, Apsu, named after that primeval ocean of sweet water out of which all human life and all natural life came, so they believed. And in fact, when the archaeologists dug deep into the temple hill, they discovered
around the time of 5000 BC, a little sand mound surrounded by a reed fence with a tiny chapel on it, marking the site of that mound of creation. Hard as it may seem in this blasted landscape, but we're in the area of the original Garden of Eden.
For what the Bible calls paradise, Eden was simply the Sumerian word Eden, the wild grassland of the south, the natural landscape before the arrival of the city. And picking over the debris of paradise, it's hard not to see the psychological truth of the Bible story. At the very beginning of our ascent to civilization was also the fall, when we tasted the fateful fruit of the tree of knowledge, the means by which we would become masters of the earth, and yet eventually gain the power to destroy it and ourselves. Truly a devil's bargain. Sumerian myths also tell how the arts of civilization, which originated here in Eridu, would bring both joy and sorrow. This, they believed, was what the gods passed on from here to future ages through the first true city on earth, Uruk. To get to Uruk today, you cross southern Iraq, skirting Ur and Nasiriyah, names familiar now after the war of 1991. Then you enter a lunar landscape, a wasteland swept by gales of sand. Immense mounds loom out of the haze in a furnace heat. It's 135 degrees out here in the summer. Finally, you come to a city gate, still visible after nearly 5,000 years. Its approach silted with a deep tide of pottery and bones. And what feelings of anticipation any city dweller of our planet in the late 20th century would experience, arriving at the place which more than any other has shaped our modern world, both in its triumphs and in its disasters. The first Westerner to stand here in modern times, the Englishman William Loftus in 1849, was simply astounded. "Of all the desolate sights I ever beheld," he said, "that of Uruk incomparably surpasses all." Still 50 feet high, the line of eroded walls curves round to the horizon. In the center of the city are the ruins of a great stepped tower, a ziggurat, on which had stood the temple of the city's goddess, Inanna, whom we know as Ishtar. The first city began as a religious center.
Standing on top of the goddess's ziggurat here in Uruk, you can get a real idea of the vast extent of this site, with a circuit of walls of more than 6 miles. Archaeology can show that these walls were built at the end of a period of extraordinary expansion, when Uruk increased 4 times in size in just a few generations. Presumably then, thousands or even tens of thousands of people were moving in from the countryside to this new city life. And there are parallels for this kind of change from rural to urban life in Europe, for example, in England during the Industrial Revolution.